Hey everybody, this is a section from Chapter 2 of Part 2 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, Third Period 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. Part 2 of the book is titled The Militarized Working Class, and the chapter I'm reading from is titled Extension of the Wage-Earning Class and the Rigidifying of Factory Despotism. And the section that I'm reading is titled The Immediate Subordination of the Workers to the Utilization Requirements of the Means of Production. This chapter is 100 pages long, so I'm not going to read the whole chapter in a whole video. So I'm breaking it down into sections. But the section that I'm reading today is the first, so there's a little introduction to the whole chapter before the first section. So here we go. Extension of the wage-earning class and the rigidifying of factory despotism. The combination of a vast rural exodus with highly centralized accumulation led to the rapid development of wage relationships. For example, between 1928 and 1940, the number of wage earners employed in the Soviet economy grew almost threefold, from 11.4 to 33.9 million. Footnote. These figures are from NKH 1970, some Soviet source. They have been revised upwards from those which were in the statistical collections published before the 1962 publication of the 1959 census results, which also revised the 1939 census results. I mention this revision because of its scale and the conclusions that can be drawn as to the dimensions of penal labor, which at least in part may or may not be included in the statistics about wage earners in the Soviet economy, To illustrate the magnitude of the statistical revisions, I would mention that in the 1956 yearbook, the same wage-earning population is estimated at 31.2 million for 1940, which corresponds to the figures obtained on the basis of annual reports from the different organizations that were required to report to the Central Statistical Office the number of wage earners they employed. End footnote. In 1940, these wage earners were more than 40% of the economically active population. This extension of wage earning was above all connected with urbanization and was an integral part of the process of accumulation. Footnote. However, the two phenomena are not identical because part of the wage earners work in places not falling into the category of towns, for example, sovkhoz and machine tractor station workers, It should also be noted that part of the wage earners in fact belong to the category of penal workers, but, as has already been said, it does not seem that these latter were usually included in the statistics of wage-earning workers. In any case, what is said here about the transformation of the wage earners' working conditions applies in principle only to the, quote, free, end quote, workers. These will be discussed later. End footnote. Like the process of accumulation, the extension of wage earning was not really under control. For example, at the end of the first 5-year plan, the number of wage earners enumerated by the Central Statistical Bureau was 22.9 million, although the plan had envisaged only 15.8 million. Footnote. See Charles Bettelheim, La Planification Soviétique, and W. Easton's article, Population and Labor Force, in the book Soviet Economic Growth, edited by A. Bergion. End footnote. As is generally known, the growth of the wage-earning population was due to the reduction in the number of peasants and kolkhozniks, but it was also due to the transformation into wage earners of numerous artisans and netmen. The enormous growth of the wage-earning population is presented by official Soviet ideologists as testimony to the henceforth socialist nature of the USSR and to the strengthening of the working class. Neither of these interpretations can be accepted. In the first place, the development of a wage-earning class cannot be regarded as identical with the development of, quote, socialism, end quote. The wage relationship is the basic capitalist relationship. Therefore, the increased number of wage earners only demonstrates the victory of the capitalist revolution, which progressed faster at the end of the 1920s. As for the working class, it is not possible to talk of the working class as, quote, strengthening. True, among the new wage earners there were numerous workers, but the number of workers among the wage earners decreased between 1928 and 1940. The proportion fell from 74.6 to 67.3%. What really happened was that there was a very rapid increase in the number of state employees and cadres, in other words, a pronounced, quote, bureaucratization, end quote, of economy and society. All the same, when it is a question of the strengthening or weakening of workers, industrial labor, or more generally of direct producers, during the 1930s the numerical trends have only a secondary importance. What is important is the change in living and working conditions that affected the mass of the wage earners, especially the workers, significantly from the beginning of the 1930s, or even from the end of the 1920s, there was a virtual anti-worker offensive which corresponded with a deepening of capitalist relationships. Footnote. One of the first stages of the anti-worker offensive was the adoption of the alleged 7-hour working day, which coincided with the setting up of allotted work, operating in circumstances especially disadvantageous for the workers. See the article by Jacques Sapir, Organisation du Travail, Classe ouvrière, Rapport social in the USSR from 1924 to 1941. I don't know how to say numbers in French. End footnote. Alright, so here we are to the actual section. The immediate subordination of the workers to the utilization requirements of the means of production. The anti-worker offensive at first took the form of a pronounced increase of the powers that administrators in the economic and state structure could bring to bear on the workers. At the end of the new economic policy, the immediate justification for this increase of power were the problems created by relatively weak labor discipline, manifested by, quote, underutilization, end quote, of the working day, end and the tendency of workers to frequently quit the enterprise those workers worked in hope of finding better working conditions elsewhere. Footnote. In 1930, this phenomenon was of such a magnitude that on average each worker changed jobs once every 8 months. See Solomon Schwartz's Labor, quoting the Soviet Statistical Yearbook for 1936. That's supposed to be a very good book, according to Donald Filzer, who's done a lot of work on labor history in the Soviet Union. End footnote. Problems posed by a pronounced labor, quote, turnover, end quote, became especially difficult after 1929, following the influx to the factories of workers lacking any experience of industrial work, who had been uprooted and subjected to many material difficulties, of housing, food supply, etc., and hence were lacking stability. However, instead of dealing with these difficulties, The authorities enhanced the disciplinary powers of managers, while the enterprises directed by the managers, found themselves allotted very difficult targets. The enterprises had to achieve a rapid increase of production and productivity with a pronounced reduction of costs. It was in order to meet these objectives that managers of enterprises were invested with ever-increasing authority, especially in matters of hiring and firing. During the new economic policy, the recruitment and dismissal of workers was not the business solely of the enterprise's managements and personnel services. At that period, the trade unions still enjoyed relative independence in their relations with the economic apparatus, and they did not have to put productivity and profitability in pride of place. At the same time, they effectively intervened in questions of recruitment and dismissal, notably by opposing decisions that would seriously harm the workers' interests. Things changed drastically at the beginning of the 1930s. In the name of industrialization and economic planning, all obstacles to the real and complete domination of recruitment and dismissal by the leaders of industry were eliminated by a series of measures whose aims and methods were basically defined by the decisions of the RSFSR Sovnarkom of September 6, 1930, of the Central Executive Committee, and USSR Sovnarkom of December 15, 1930, and of the USSR Labor Commissariat of December 28, 1930. Footnote. Schwartz followed these questions very closely and systematically combed the press of the time and will be frequently quoted in this present work. End footnote. The officially envisaged aims included the most, quote, efficient and, quote, possible utilization of the means of production, planned allocation of the labor force, the, quote, optimal distribution of the available workers between industrial enterprises, branches of industry, and regions, end quote, and, quote, control over the rational utilization of the workforce in enterprises of the socialized sector, end quote. Clearly, it was not so much a question of assuring a certain, quote, stability, end quote, in the workforce as to, quote, direct, end quote, the latter in accordance with the, quote, needs, end quote, of the state enterprises and of economic growth and accumulation. The decisions adopted in this way expressed a political will, but their application in practice encountered many obstacles. The existence of labor legislation passed in the early 1920s that acknowledged a series of workers' rights, parenthesis, only bit by bit could this legislation be abrogated or systematically infringed, end parenthesis. The resistance of workers who, as the years passed, found ways of evading the regulations, the non-cooperation of enterprise managers, each trying to recruit a large number of workers in order to reach the production plans for which the manager was responsible, the ignorance of the real, quote, needs, end quote, for manpower of the various industries, and so on. In fact, the 1930 measures failed. The same fate befell the attempts made by enterprise managers to try to reduce labor turnover by getting workers to sign an undertaking not to leave the factory before a certain period had elapsed. Acknowledging these failures, the authorities, parenthesis, with the cooperation of the trade unions, in parenthesis, adopted ever stricter measures to limit and finally prevent workers leaving their employment. New section, Section A, the progressive disappearance of the workers' freedom to make and break work contracts. At the beginning of 1931, the Central Committee of Trade Unions changed the rules for Social Security so as to make sick benefits and other benefits vary in amount according to a worker's period of service at his enterprise. In later years, his ruling became more and more severe. This ruling became more and more severe. These measures having proved insufficient in relation to the aims envisaged by the Soviet government, the latter decided on the 27th of September 1932 to reintroduce the internal passport. Henceforth, each wage earner had to hand in his passport to the enterprise which employed him. The passport was to carry a mention of previous jobs held by the holder. In this way, a check was made on the conditions under which a worker had left his previous job. With this decree, the authorities also envisaged that they could reduce the growth of the urban population in a period of food supply and housing crisis, and anchor the kolkhozniks in their villages since, as everyone realized, only in exceptional cases would kolkhozniks get passports. In general, the kolkhozniks and peasants could only obtain a temporary certificate to allow them to carry out seasonal work. This certificate was valid for a maximum of 3 months and could be extended only by request of the employer. Figures show that from 1933, labor turnover slackened in industry. In 1935, the average period of employment in an enterprise reached almost 14 months, although this was still short. A new measure was therefore taken in December 1938. This is the general introduction for all wage earners of the workbook. Footnote: for workers with certain skills and employed in industry and transport, the labor book had been introduced from February 1931. By a decree of the 20th of December 1938, this labor book was henceforth issued to all wage earners. End footnote. This booklet was originated by the enterprise that took on a worker for his first job. During the currency of the work contract, the enterprise retained his booklet and noted in it all the points laid down by the law and in particular punishments imposed on the worker. The booklet was returned to its holder only if the enterprise employing him agreed to dispense with him. To get himself employed elsewhere, the worker had to hand his booklet to the new employer, who otherwise could not take him on. In this way, each worker was bound to an enterprise, and his successive employers knew all about his working career. At least that was the intention, although it seems that in fact that quite a number of workers changed their jobs without observing the regulations. Therefore, so as to tie the worker even more firmly to the enterprise, other measures were taken that reinforced the arrangements made in the decree of December 20th, 1938. This involved mainly the decree of December 28th of 1938, which was adopted, according to the official explanation, in order to, quote, strengthen labor discipline, improve the administration of social insurance, and struggle against abuses in all fields, end quote. This decree imposed on a worker wishing to leave his job a 1-month notice, in place of 6 days. Even if this requirement was observed, a worker who left his job without the agreement of his management lost any right to social insurance benefits for the first 6 months of his new job. Agreements of the original management was not enough to preserve the rights of the workers. Such rights were reduced in effect, for in order to receive full benefits, it was necessary to belong to the same enterprise and be unionized for at least 6 years. The shorter the employment and enterprise, the more were sickness benefits reduced. Footnote: these measures were made worse after the war. Parenthesis, by a decree of August 9th, 1948. See Solomon Schwartz, page 316, end parenthesis, which shows that they were not due in any special way to the circumstances of the 1930s. End footnote. As it was concluded that the effects of these different decisions were not enough, a decree of June 26, 1940 remodeled labor legislation and strengthened disciplinary measures. It reintroduced the 8-hour day and the 7-day week, and explicitly forbade, quote, workers and employees to leave their enterprise of their own volition, end quote. Footnote: a decree of November 1917 had introduced the 8-hour day, an old demand of the Russian Social Democratic Party. In 1927, with the introduction of allotted work, the 7-hour day had been introduced. From 1929, there was an extension of the, quote, 5-day week, end quote. Parenthesis, 4 days work and 1 day of rest, in parenthesis, or the 6-day week, the rest day varying so that the enterprises did not break off work. The decree of June 1940 returned to the 7-day week. bracket, 6 full-time days and 1 day of rest, the latter being fixed, end bracket. It was a question of increasing work hours without a corresponding wage increase and was in contradiction with the 1936 Constitution, bracket, modified only in 1947, end bracket. And footnote. Article 4 of the Decree of June 26, 1940, provided that a worker could not quit an enterprise except in exceptional circumstances, parenthesis, illness, invalidity, retirement, end parenthesis. Article 5 stipulated penal sanctions, parenthesis, 2 to 4 months in prison, end parenthesis, to fall on workers leaving their job without permission. Job quitting could be penalized in particular by, quote, corrective labor carried out at the factory without deprivation of freedom, end quote. Parenthesis, Article 20 of the Penal Code, end parenthesis. This labor was paid at a lower rate than normal work and was subject to stricter discipline, parenthesis, with infringements of this discipline entailing the imposition of a penitentiary regime, end parenthesis. This labor was paid at a lower rate than normal work and was subject to stricter discipline, parenthesis, with infringements of this discipline entailing the imposition of a penitentiary regime, end parenthesis. In reality, this, quote, corrective labor, end quote, was a form of penal labor carried out at the usual place of work. In reality, this, quote, corrective labor, end quote, was a form of penal labor carried out at the usual place of work. In September 1940, it was decided that the time spent at, quote, correctional labor, end quote, would be regarded as an interruption of employment that invalidated the worker's right to social insurance. The right would be restored only after 6 months of normal work. In the meantime, all right to sickness benefits disappeared. The Journal of the Soviet Procuracy published several articles encouraging severest interpretations of these decisions. Footnote, articles demanding a, quote, iron discipline, end quote, may be found in Sovietskaya Zakonstvy of October and December 1940, end footnote. The reluctance of judges to enforce these various measures appeared so great that the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet published an order on the, quote, disciplinary responsibility of judges, end quote, enabling action to be taken against those who applied them with less than the required severity. Another order dated the 10th of August 1940 provided that in matters of penal labor legislation, judgments would be passed by a single judge, not by the judicial collegium of 1 judge and 2 assessors. These 2 orders were actually contrary to Article 112 of the 1936 Constitution, which provided for the, quote, independence of judges, end quote, and the collegial structure of all tribunals concerned with penal cases. Obviously, these were far from the first violations of the Constitution, but it is noteworthy that they were published in legal texts. These various measures, as well as others which brought a severe intensification of labor discipline, were taken in peacetime at a time when the government and the press claimed that, thanks to the Russo-German Pact, the danger of war had receded. Moreover, they remained in force for several years after the war, although they were then, to some extent, falling into decay. As for the true wartime measures, parenthesis, that is, those concerning labor mobilization, in parenthesis, the true wartime measures did not appear until 1941 and 1942, and in principle did not remain in force after the war. On the whole, during the 1930s and early 1940s, there was a continuing reduction of freedom enjoyed by workers to conclude or break work contracts. At the same time, labor legislation tended towards transformation into penal legislation. At the same time, labor legislation tended towards transformation into penal legislation. Thus, efforts to develop to, quote, plan, and, quote, employment directly. Among these efforts, a special place belonged to the measures permitting compulsory transfers of labor and the, quote, organized recruitment, and, quote, of workers. The fact is that while the authorities refused workers the right to change their jobs, they provided enterprises with the possibility of transferring workers from one job to another. New section, Section B. Dismissal and obligatory transfers from one enterprise to another. The already mentioned decision of the Central Executive Committee of Sovnarkom, dated December 15, 1930, gave ample powers to the labor commissariats of the USSR and the different republics to, quote, systematically redistribute the labor force within the framework of production plans fixed by the competent authorities, end quote. The text of the decision was really intended to apply essentially to skilled workers and technicians. In 1930, in fact, unskilled labor was still abundantly available. The text of December 15, 1930, and the text which followed soon after, aimed above all at reducing the, quote, excesses, end quote, of labor that some enterprises strove to preserve in order to cope better with their production targets. That is, they aimed to remove the, quote, spare fat, end quote, of these enterprises, or as was said at the time, to, quote, scrape off, end quote, the excess of workers. Footnote. In any case, at this time, a management of an enterprise could dismiss a worker for many reasons. For a punishment, because it was, quote, necessary, end quote, to reduce the workforce, bracket, a period of notice had then to be observed, and in certain cases a redundancy payment might be paid, and bracket. In principle, the agreement of the trade union, local, and enterprise organizations was required. In the 1930s situation, such agreement was almost always granted. End footnote. In 1932, the Presidium of the USSR Supreme Court established a distinction between workers on the one hand and specialists and technicians on the other. Workers could refuse a transfer, in which case workers were dismissed. Specialists and technicians had to accept a transfer or face eventual penal prosecution. After the abolition by decree of June 23, 1933, of the Commissariat of Labor, the right of carrying out the measures described in the provisions already mentioned fell to enterprise managements and to the main managements of the industrial commissariats or commissariats to which they had been subordinated. It was the measures for, quote, removing the fat, end quote, which above all continued to be taken at this period. On the other hand, certain provisions of the decrees of June 26, 1940 and October 20, 1940 put greater emphasis on the compulsory movement of workers from one place to another. These provisions allowed, quote, the forced transfer of engineers, technicians, foremen, employees, and skilled workers of an enterprise, administration, or institution to another, end quote. They were later extended to numerous categories of workers. The latter could not refuse a transfer except in special cases, save in such cases refusal bar penal sanctions. Footnote, little by little, these measures fell into desuetude after the war, they were formally abolished only in 1956. End footnote. The same kind of thing happened with the creation of, quote, manpower reserves, end quote. New section, Section C, the creation of, quote, manpower reserves, end quote. From the first 5-year plan, efforts were made with a view to installing a system of obligatory allocation of young workers to jobs decided by the state administrations. From the first 5-year plan, efforts were made with a view to installing a system of obligatory allocation of young workers to jobs decided by the state administrations. Thus, a decision of the Supreme Economic Council, VSNKH, of November 27, 1929, compelled young people graduating from enterprise vocational schools, parenthesis, essentially workers' sons, in parenthesis, to spend 3 years in a job to which they were posted by the economic department that had financed their vocational training schools. On the 15th of September 1933, the decision was confirmed by the Central Executive Committee and Sovnarkom. Numerous indications had suggested that compulsory postings were encountering difficulties, hence the need for the 1933 confirmation. The regulation was confirmed by a decree of October 2, 1940, which created a new organ, the, quote, General Directorate of Labor Reserves, end quote. Supervising all vocational schools, this General Directorate was to recruit each year 800,000 to 1 million young people 14 to 15 years who would spend 2 years in these schools. The decree of October 2nd specified that if there was an inadequate number of volunteers for these schools, the annual contingent would be topped up by compulsory direction. In the countryside, it was Kolkhoz's chairman who carried out the selection process, limited to 2% of each age group. In the towns, the town Soviet did this. At first, these arrangements applied only to young men. When the USSR entered the war, they were extended to young women. The establishment of a system of labor reserves was undoubtedly accelerated by the war, but it was nevertheless maintained after the war, with the creation of a labor reserves ministry. This system had an obvious class significance. This system was not universal. This system had an obvious class significance. This system was not universal. For example, secondary students, parenthesis, 8 years and upwards, in parenthesis, and higher education students were exempt. On the other hand, another decree of the same date, of the 2nd of October 1940, abolished, parenthesis, contrary to the 1936 Constitution, in parenthesis, the secondary education, parenthesis, 8th to 10th year, in parenthesis, and higher education grants. In consequence, young people exempt from recruitment by the labor reserves services were essentially the children of parents whose salaries were high enough to pay for secondary and higher education. The decree of October 2nd stipulated that only those students and pupils who had, quote, excellent, end quote, notation would qualify for a study grant. There is a text in English of this decree in A. Bergson's The Structure of Soviet Wages. In 1940, the grants varied from 150 to 200 rubles per year for schools and from 300 to 500 for universities. At that time, the average monthly wage of a first-category worker, bracket, the lowest paid, in bracket, was around 100 rubles. It should be mentioned that after the death of Stalin, the university grants were abolished. In 1958, 60 to 70% of Moscow students were the children of cadres or members of the intelligentsia. See J.R. Azriel, Managerial Power in Soviet Politics. End footnote. These measures were part of a virtual anti-worker offensive, but they represent only one aspect of a process which increasingly prevented the immediate producers from exercising direct influence on their conditions of work. Another aspect was the transformation, to be examined shortly, of the methods by which wages and work norms were determined. Such an offensive, moreover, could not be set in motion without the subjection of the workers to a systematic and severe repression. The latter, as is well known, expressed itself in the development of police organs inside enterprises and in the extension of forced labor. All the changes which affected in these ways the situation of the workers expressed the intensifying grip on the workers put by the demands of capital and of accumulation. Marx had already observed that one of the characteristics of capital is that the worker in fact belongs to the capitalist class, before the worker sells himself to an individual capitalist. During the 1930s, the authorities reduced to a minimum the visible freedom of the worker to take opportunities to sell his work capacity, and this helped to atomize the working class. Okay, so this is the end of the first section of Chapter 2 of Part 2 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR. Third period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. Part 2 of the book is titled The Militarized Working Class. Chapter 2 is titled Extension of the Wage-Earning Class and the Rigidifying of Factory Despotism. The section that I just read is titled The Immediate Subordination of the Workers to the Utilization Requirements of the Means of Production. The next section is titled The Authoritarian Determination of Working Conditions and the Development of Factory Despotism. Thank you so much for listening.